I had $11 in my checking account, a manila folder full of papers I barely understood, and not a single person sitting behind me in that courtroom. On the other side of the aisle sat 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than my monthly rent, representing a company that wanted to take away the one thing I had left. I remember gripping that folder so hard my knuckles went white, thinking, this is it. This is where I lose everything. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that in the next 40 minutes, a judge who had seen 10,000 cases just like mine was about to say 11 words that would blow the entire case wide open, and nobody in that room, least of all me, would ever forget it. My name is Maren Whitfield, and 3 years ago I was 34 years old, working 2 jobs, raising my son Eli by myself, and doing everything I possibly could to keep a roof over our heads. I want to tell you this story slowly, the way it happened to me, because I think the slowness is part of what almost broke me. Nothing about what happened was fast. It was a long, grinding erosion, the kind where you don't notice the ground disappearing under your feet until you're standing on nothing. It started with a letter. A cold, formal letter from a property management company called Ashgrove Holdings, informing me that my lease, the lease on the small 2-bedroom apartment where Eli and I had lived for 4 years, was being terminated for material breach of contract, and that I had 30 days to vacate. I read that letter maybe 6 times standing in my kitchen, my hands shaking, waiting for it to suddenly make sense. It never did. I had never missed a rent payment. Not once. I had bank statements to prove it. I had emailed receipts going back years. I had done everything a tenant is supposed to do. I paid on time. I kept the apartment clean. I never complained about the broken heater in December because I didn't want to make waves. So when the letter said material breach, my first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. I called the leasing office. I got voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I drove down there in person and was told, very politely, by a young woman who wouldn't meet my eyes, that all communications needed to go through their legal department now, and she handed me a card with a phone number that, when I called it, connected me to an automated system that never once let me speak to a human being. I didn't understand yet that this wasn't a mistake. This was a strategy. See, about 2 months before that letter arrived, a new investment group had bought the building I lived in. And when new investment groups buy old buildings full of tenants with below-market rent, which is what Eli and I had, because I'd signed that lease 4 years earlier before the neighborhood got discovered, they have 2 choices. They can raise the rent slowly, the honest way, and lose money for a year or 2 while long-term tenants finish out their leases. Or they can find a reason, any reason, to push people out fast, gut the building, and re-rent every unit at triple the price. I was, without knowing it, standing in the way of somebody's spreadsheet. I spent the next several weeks trying to find a lawyer. I called every legal aid office in the county. Most of them were so backed up that the earliest consultation they could offer me was 2 months out, a month after I'd already be required to leave. I called private attorneys, and the cheapest quote I got for representation was $4,500, which might as well have been $4 million to me at the time. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed one night after Eli had fallen asleep, doing math on the back of an envelope, trying to figure out if I could sell my car, sell my furniture, sell anything, to scrape together enough money for a lawyer, and coming up short every single time. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being poor and being right. You'd think being right would count for something. You'd think the truth would just naturally rise to the surface and protect you. But the truth doesn't defend itself. It needs someone to speak it out loud, in the right room, in the right way, and if you can't afford someone to do that for you, the truth can sit in a folder on your kitchen table for the rest of your life and change nothing. I want to pause here and tell you a little about Eli, because he's the reason none of this ever felt optional to me. Eli was 7 years old that year. He had a gap between his front teeth and an encyclopedic knowledge of dinosaurs that he'd recite to me at bedtime like a lullaby. Did you know that the Rhizinosaurus had claws over 3 feet long, Mom? He didn't know what was happening. I made sure of that. I smiled through phone calls with debt collectors and property managers, and I made pancakes on Saturday mornings like everything was fine, because I had decided, somewhere in the panic, that whatever else happened, Eli was not going to carry this weight. I would carry it, all of it. But carrying it alone was killing me. Ashgrove Holdings filed for an expedited eviction hearing. When I finally got a legal aid appointment, just 5 days before my court date, the attorney I spoke with, a tired but kind woman named Denise, looked through my file for about 20 minutes and then looked up at me with an expression I'll never forget. It was somewhere between anger and pity. "Marin," she said, "there is no material breach here. I don't see one shred of evidence supporting their claim. This looks like a pretext eviction. But I have to be honest with you, I cannot represent you at this hearing. My caseload is completely full and your court date is in 5 days. So what do? I asked her. She slid a legal pad across the table toward me. You go in and you represent yourself. And Marin, I know that sounds impossible right now, but I need you to hear this. The judges in that courthouse have seen 100 cases exactly like yours. If your paper trail is as clean as it looks, you have a real chance. You just have to stay calm, stick to the facts, and not let them intimidate you. Don't let them intimidate you. I laughed a little when she said that, not because it was funny, but because I already knew what Thursday was going to feel like. I already knew I'd be sitting alone at a table built for two, in a room full of strangers whose entire job was to make sure people like me lost. I didn't sleep the night before the hearing. I lay in bed running through every scenario, every question a judge might ask, every way Ashgrove's lawyers could twist a simple fact into something that sounded damning. I had organized my folder obsessively, bank statements highlighted in yellow, rent receipts in chronological order, printed emails, even a timeline I'd typed up myself with dates and page references, like I was building a case file for a trial I'd only ever seen on television. I dropped Eli off at my neighbor Connie's apartment that morning. Connie had become something like family to us over the years, a retired schoolteacher who kept an eye on Eli whenever I picked up an extra shift. She hugged me at the door, and I remember her holding my shoulders and looking me straight in the eye and saying, "You have done nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing. Whatever that judge sees today, they're going to see a good mother who's been paying her bills." I nodded, but I didn't believe her. Not really. Because I had learned, over the previous 2 months, that being right and being believed were two very different things. I got to the courthouse 45 minutes early. I sat on a hard wooden bench outside Courtroom 4B, my folder in my lap, watching people come and go. A man in a wrinkled security guard uniform walked past me twice. A young couple argued quietly near the water fountain about custody paperwork. And then, at 8:52 a.m., I watched 3 people in tailored suits walk past me and through the double doors of Courtroom 4B, Ashgrove Holdings' legal team. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, glanced at me for exactly 1 second, the way you'd glance at a piece of furniture, and then looked away. I felt smaller in that second than I had in my entire life. At 9 o'clock, the bailiff called my case. I stood up, and my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I walked into that courtroom completely and totally alone, and I sat down at the defendant's table across from 3 lawyers who had, between them, probably argued 1,000 cases just like mine. Behind them sat a 4th man I didn't recognize yet, Ashgrove's regional operations director, there, I would later learn, specifically to watch me lose. The judge hadn't entered yet. I set my folder down on the table, and my hands were shaking so badly that a few papers slid out, and I had to scramble to gather them before anyone noticed. One of the opposing lawyers, the silver-haired one, glanced over with an expression that wasn't quite a smirk, but was close enough to one that it made my stomach drop. "All rise," the bailiff said, "the Honorable Judge Adele Restrepo presiding." And that was the moment everything I thought I knew about this day was about to be turned upside down. Judge Adele Restrepo walked into that courtroom like she owned gravity itself. She was maybe 60 years old, silver-streaked hair pulled back tightly, reading glasses perched low on her nose, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who had absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. I would learn later that she had been on the bench for over 20 years, and before that, she had spent a decade as a public defender working cases for people who couldn't afford lawyers, people exactly like me. She sat down, opened the file in front of her, and without looking up said, "Ashgrove Holdings versus Whitfield. Eviction matter." "Yes, Your Honor," the silver-haired lawyer sighed. D. rising smoothly. "Marcus Delane, representing the plaintiff." Judge Restrepo's eyes flicked up, just briefly, toward me, and the defendant is representing herself. "I am, Your Honor," I said, and my voice cracked slightly on the word honor, which embarrassed me more than I can say. She held my gaze for a moment longer than I expected. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't pity either. It was something more like attention, the kind of attention that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like I was actually being seen instead of processed. "All right," she said. "Mr. Delane, proceed." Marcus Delane stood and began speaking in that smooth, practiced cadence lawyers have, the kind of voice that makes even the flimsiest argument sound like bedrock fact. He explained that Ashgrove Holdings had terminated my lease due to repeated material breaches of contract, including unauthorized occupants and failure to maintain the premises in accordance with lease terms. He gestured toward a stack of documents his associate handed to the bailiff, who passed them up to the judge. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Unauthorized occupants. I lived with my 7-year-old son. That was it. That was the entire household. I had never once had anyone else staying with me, no roommate, no boyfriend, nobody. I scribbled a note on my legal pad. No unauthorized occupants, only Eli, my son, listed on lease. Delane continued, citing what he called documented maintenance violations and noise complaints from neighboring units. His voice smooth and confident, laying out a version of my life that I didn't recognize at all. It was like listening to someone describe a stranger and calling her by my name. When he finished, Judge Restrepo looked over her glasses at me. "Ms. Whitfield, you may respond." I stood up. My folder felt impossibly heavy in my hands. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the mirror the night before, and every rehearsed word evaporated the second I opened my mouth. "Your Honor," I said, I don't know what documentation Mr. Delane is referring to, because I've never received any notice of a maintenance violation or a noise complaint in the 4 years I've lived at that address. I have my rent payment history right here." I held up my folder, hands trembling, every single payment on time for 4 years. I have never had an unauthorized occupant. It's just me and my son. Delane rose again, unbothered. "Your Honor, if I may, Ashgrove's records indicate 3 separate complaint filings from neighboring tenants regarding noise and unregistered occupants, dated within the last 6 months." "I have never seen those complaints," I said, and I could hear my own voice rising, panic creeping in at the edges. "I was never notified. I was never given a chance to respond to them. The first thing I ever received was a termination letter." Judge Restrepo held up one hand and the room went quiet immediately. She looked down at the documents in front of her for a long moment, a much longer moment than felt comfortable. She flipped a page, then another. Her brow furrowed slightly, the first real expression she'd shown since sitting down. "Mr. Delane," she said slowly, "these complaint filings you're referencing, I don't see them in the exhibit packet submitted to the court." Delane's associate shuffled through a folder. "Your Honor, we can have those produced." "You can have them produced now, or I'm striking the claim," Judge Restrepo said, not unkindly, but with an edge that made even Delane straighten his posture. "This is an expedited hearing you requested. I don't have time for documents to be produced at your convenience. Either they exist and you have them here today, or they don't exist and we move forward without them." There was a pause, a long one. Delane conferred quietly with his associate, and I really watched for the first time all morning as something in his composure cracked. Just slightly, just enough. "Your Honor," he finally said, "we do not have those specific filings in hand at this moment, but we can attest to their existence based on internal records." Judge Restrepo took off her glasses entirely and set them down on the bench. And this was the moment. This was the moment everything changed. "I want you to understand what it feels like to sit in a courtroom, alone, having spent 2 months believing you were fighting an unwinnable battle against people with infinite resources and infinite patience. And then to watch, in real time, the ground shift beneath the other side's feet instead of your own." Judge Restrepo leaned forward slightly. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured, but it carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had stopped being polite. "Mr. Delane," she said, "I've read a lot of eviction filings in 22 years on this bench." She paused. The whole room seemed to lean in with her. "This one smells like a pretext." 11's. Words, that's what it was, 11 words that landed in that courtroom like a thunderclap. I felt my whole body go still. Delane opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Restrepo raised her hand again, and this time there was no mistaking the authority in the gesture. "I'm going to walk through what's in front of me," she continued, "and Mr. Delane, I want you to correct me if I'm wrong about anything. Ms. Whitfield has submitted 4 years of rent payment records showing 0 late payments and 0 missed payments. Correct?" "That appears accurate, Your Honor," Delane said. Ashgrove's own lease file lists exactly 2 occupants at this address, Ms. Whitfield and a minor child. Correct. Correct, Your Honor. And the material breach, cited in the termination letter, unauthorized occupants and maintenance violations, is supported by exactly 0 documents in this courtroom. Correct. Silence. Delane's associate looked down at the table. "I asked you a question, Counselor." "Correct, Your Honor," Delane said quietly. Judge Restrepo sat back in her chair. "Here's what I know happens in this county, Mr. Delane, and I want to say this plainly, on the record, because I think it needs to be said plainly. Buildings get bought by investment groups. Investment groups look at long-term leases with below-market rent, and instead of waiting out those leases like the contract requires, some of them manufacture a pretext to terminate early, so they can release the unit at triple the price. I have seen this pattern in this courtroom no fewer than 6 times in the last 18 months. And every single time, the fact pattern looks exactly like what I'm looking at right now. A spotless tenant, a sudden termination letter, and 0 supporting documentation when it actually comes time to prove the claim in front of a judge." She turned to me then, and her expression softened, just slightly, not softening the law, but softening toward me, the person. "Ms. Whitfield, is there anything else you'd like to add before I rule?" My throat was so tight I almost couldn't speak. Just that I've never given them a reason to want me gone, except that I've been there a long time, and my rent is lower than what they could charge someone new. That's the only breach I can think of. Judge Restrepo almost smiled at that. Almost. "That's not a breach of contract, Ms. Whitfield. That's just capitalism trying to find a legal costume to wear." What happened next moved fast, in the way that important things sometimes do after they've been agonizingly slow for months. Judge Restrepo denied Ashgrove's eviction claim entirely, ruling that the plaintiff had failed to provide any evidence of material breach, and that the termination notice appeared, in her words, issued in bad faith, without cause, and calculated to circumvent the tenant's contractual rights. But she didn't stop there. She looked directly at Marcus Delane and said, "I'm also referring this file to the county's Tenant Protection Unit for review of a pattern of retaliatory filings by Ashgrove Holdings. If this is happening to Ms. Whitfield, I have a hard time believing she's the only tenant it's happening to." I sat there, stunned, gripping the edge of the table, as the reality of what had just occurred slowly worked its way through the fog of panic I'd been living in for 2 months. I had walked into that courtroom that morning fully expecting to lose. I had a folder full of evidence and no one to argue it for me, and somehow, because a judge with 2 decades of experience recognized a pattern the moment she saw it, the truth had actually won. Delane gathered his papers without another word, his composure fully restored by the time he reached the door, the way people like that always seem to recover. The regional operations director who'd come to watch me lose didn't even look at me on his way out. But I noticed something as they left, a flicker of irritation on his face that told me this wasn't the outcome he'd been expecting either. I stayed seated for a moment after the courtroom emptied out, just breathing. The bailiff walked past and gave me a small, knowing nod, the kind of nod that told me he'd seen this exact scene play out before, in both directions, and he was glad this was one of the good ones. When I finally stood up to leave, Judge Restrepo was still at the bench, reviewing the next file. She glanced up at me, and I don't know what came over me, but I said, "Thank you, Your Honor. I don't think you understand what you just did for my son and me." She looked at me for a long moment. "Ms. Whitfield, I didn't do anything except read the file in front of me and ask the questions it deserved. You did the hard part. You showed up. You kept every receipt. You didn't let them intimidate you into skipping this hearing, even without a lawyer. That's the part that actually matters. I just made sure the room paid attention to it." I walked out of that courtroom into a June afternoon that felt, for the first time in 2 months, like it belonged to me again. I want to tell you that everything got easy after that, but that wouldn't be honest. And honesty is the whole reason I'm telling you this story. The relief I felt walking out of that courthouse was enormous, but it didn't erase 2 months of fear, and it didn't erase the 4 years of below-market rent that Ashgrove Holdings clearly still wanted to reclaim by any means necessary. But something had shifted. I had proof now, not just my own conviction, but a judge's ruling on the record that I had done nothing wrong. And more than that, I had learned something about myself that I don't think I would have learned any other way, that I was capable of standing in a room full of people trained to make me doubt myself and staying steady anyway. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Denise, the legal aid attorney who told me I'd have to go it alone. The county's tenant protection unit had opened a formal investigation into Ashgrove Holdings after Judge Restrepo's referral, and it turned out I wasn't the only tenant in that building who'd received a suspiciously similar termination letter in the same month. 4 other households had gotten nearly identical notices citing vague, undocumented material breaches. Denise told me that with the judge's ruling as precedent, the other tenants now had a much stronger case, and 2 of them had already reached out to her office for help. I hadn't just won my own case. Without meaning to, I'd cracked open a pattern that was hurting other families too, families who, like me, had been paying their rent faithfully for years and had no idea they were about to become collateral in somebody else's profit margin. Ashgrove Holdings eventually settled with the Tenant Protection Unit, agreeing to honor all existing leases through their full terms and to pay into a tenant relief fund as part of the resolution. I don't know all the details of what happened behind closed doors after that, but I know that Eli and I got to stay in our apartment for another full year before we ever had to think about moving again. And when we finally did move, it was because we chose to, not because someone forced our hand. I picked Eli up from Connie's apartment that evening after the hearing, and when he ran up to hug me at the door, dinosaur facts already spilling out of him before I'd even said hello, I hugged him back so tightly he laughed and told me I was squishing him. I hadn't told him anything about the court case, not the fear, not the folder, not the sleepless night before. But I remember crouching down to his eye level that evening and saying, "Hey, bud, we're okay, we're going to be okay." He looked at me with the easy, uncomplicated trust that 7-year-olds have, like the idea that we might not be okay had never once crossed his mind. "I know, Mom," he said. "You always figure it out." I hadn't figured it out alone, not really. I'd had a legal aid attorney who gave me 20 honest minutes when she didn't have to. I'd had a neighbor who held my shoulders and told me the truth before I could believe it myself. And I'd had a judge who looked at a pile of paperwork and refused to let a well-dressed lie walk out of her courtroom just because it arrived in an expensive suit. But there was a version of that morning where none of that mattered, where I walked in, sat down alone, and the whole machine just rolled forward the way it was built to. I think about that version sometimes. I think about all the people who walk into rooms just like that one, every single day, with a folder full of the truth and no one beside them to help the truth get heard. I think about how much depends, in this world, on whether the person behind the bench is paying attention. People ask me sometimes what I remember most from that day, and I always give the same answer. It's not the fear beforehand, though I remember that clearly. It's not the relief afterward, though that was overwhelming too. It's those 11 words, "This one smells like a pretext," spoken by a woman who didn't know me from any other name on her docket that morning, but who cared enough about what justice actually meant to look past the polish of a 3-lawyer legal team and ask a simple, devastating question: where's the proof? I keep that manila folder in a drawer in my apartment to this day. The edges are worn soft now, the highlighter faded on some of the older receipts. Eli is 10 now, still obsessed with dinosaurs, though these days it's less the Rhizinosaurus and more Spinosaurus, whatever's trending in his corner of the internet that week. He doesn't know the full story of what almost happened to us that year. Maybe someday, when he's older, I'll tell him, not to scare him, but so he understands what his mother was capable of on a morning when she felt like she had nothing left. I walked into that courtroom alone, but I didn't out that way. I walked out having learned that being right isn't enough in this world. You also have to be brave enough to say it out loud, even when your voice shakes, even when the room is stacked against you, even when $11 is all you have left in your checking account, and everyone across the aisle looks like they were born knowing how to win. Sometimes the whole world turns on 11 words from someone who was finally, actually listening. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is one person refusing to look away from the truth, sitting quietly in a folder, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question.